Hey there everybody, it's markcrilley. I'm back with another video. Today we're going to be talking about the first page of your story. Whether it be a graphic novel or just prose fiction, I'm going to be giving you my best advice, 6 different pieces of advice about that very first page. And it's going to include examples of my comics, including one from this book, which I have never shown before in any of my videos. Well, let's not waste any more time. Let's go ahead and get into it. Number 1, the first page is often bold and memorable. It doesn't look or read like just another page. Now, unquestionably, looking back at my own graphic novel stories, Miki Falls is the best example of this one. The very first page is this image of Miki crashing through a window. In fact, the publisher liked that opening so much that they made this unusual choice of having it be the actual first printed page in the book. When you open a book, normally you don't leap right into the story. There's a title page, there's, copyright stuff, and they didn't do that. They just went straight into it because, I think, it was such a bold and kind of almost shocking way to begin the story, seeing someone crashing through a window. Of course, it's not the true beginning of the story. As we continue, we find that we're going to sort of go back in time, as she has fallen to the ground after crashing through the window, and then we sort of go back in time and begin. This is where the real beginning of the story takes place. But that was my sort of technique to get a very bold opening first page. Don't start at the beginning of the story. I said, let's start at the most exciting part of the story and then flash back. So as to begin more traditionally. Something worth considering if you want that first page to be very, very memorable. Number 2, if your story is narrated by one of its characters, the first page may establish that character's voice, conveying his or her personality. Now for this one, the best example is my first published comic book, Akiko on the Planet Smoo. And here on the first page we get into the narration, because the whole story is told from the point of view of this main character, Akiko. And I'll just sort of read this first part here. My name is Akiko. This is the story of the adventure I had a few months ago when I went to the Planet Smoo. I know it's kind of hard to believe, but it really did happen. I swear. And so there you're getting a little flavor of her voice, and this is leading you into the story. It establishes, who's going to be telling this story and who's going to be sort of leading you through it from beginning to end. So that's something to be aware of, that on your first page, if you are indeed having something told from the first person point of view, you have to be conscious that that is your reader's first impression of that narration, and you got to be careful about the words that you choose and make sure that you've figured out what is the voice of this character. Interestingly, this page does look like just another page, and so it shows you sometimes I was still figuring things out. This was my first story. I think I wouldn't do such a relatively bland looking opening page now, all these years later, but it shows you, it takes a while to figure these things out. Number 3, if the first page is wordless, the artwork becomes even more important. It is the reader's first impression of the story, so you'll want it to be a good one. Now for this one, the best example is Brody's Ghost, my graphic novel series. It was originally published as 6 different books, but they've brought it together into a single volume, which means that this first page in the first book is even more important. It really is your entryway into the story. And since I decided to make it wordless, the reader is kind of forced to study it and sort of see, why is this the first page? What am I being shown here? Well, we see that this guy lives in this incredibly messy apartment. And that is our first impression of Brody, the main character of our story. And by having it be wordless, with no narration, it really forces you to get all the information visually. So that makes this first illustration super important. And if you are doing such a story, I would advise you pay real close attention to that first image. It's going to kind of burn its way into the mind of the reader and become, in a certain way, a symbol of the story as they move forward. Number 4, this comes down to personal taste, but I feel that the first page shouldn't burden the reader with excessive wordiness. Now, sadly, here's one where I have to use myself as a negative example. This story, The Beast That Ate Morioka. This is even older than the Akiko on the Planet Smooth story, in that it remained unpublished for years. So Akiko was the first published one, but this I had actually done earlier. And here you go, already sort of violating that just another page rule. The first book, or the first page, does sort of look like just another page, but it is certainly violating what I'm talking about here in terms of wordiness. Look at all just the writing. If you're doing a graphic novel, I personally feel that it's unpleasant as a reader to see a huge long paragraph in the first page just packed with words. To me, it seems more inviting if we lay back on the wordiness and allow the pictures to tell more of the story, at least until we get a little bit into the first few scenes. So there you go. Do as I say, not as I do. But again, it's a matter of personal taste. Some people might, I can certainly imagine a story that has a kind of fairy tale-like story, and they begin with this very long opening paragraph. It could work. This one does just kind of come down to personal taste. Number 5, the first page doesn't necessarily launch the first important scene of the story. Sometimes it is merely setting things up so that a more important scene can take place. Now for this one, a good example is my graphic novel that teaches you how to draw, the drawing lesson. And indeed, it begins, as we get past the opening pages, with this scene that takes place in a park. We don't necessarily know that until we pull back, but it begins with this boy who's looking at a how to draw book. And suddenly he hears a voice of this book salesman saying, "Kid!" And then we move over to him saying, "Hey, I ain't running a library here. You gonna buy that book or not?" Sounds like the Brooklyn guy. But this scene is not, I would say, the important first scene of the book. It's really just sort of setting things up so that we can turn the page and have him, at this point, look over and see this woman who's drawing. And that's when we get into the real first scene of the story. So sometimes your first page is not necessarily the beginning of the crucial first scene. It's just sort of laying things up for the actual first scene. That's also true of Brody's Ghost. Maybe I'll go ahead and bring it back out real quick to show. That scene of him in his messy bedroom. Again, I wouldn't say that this is the important first scene. The real important first scene is when he comes into the city and sits down and starts playing guitar. So there's all this all this preliminary stuff that's just sort of setting things up for the arrival of Talia, this second character. Sometimes your first scene is all about setup, sort of laying things out so that you can get into the really important stuff that launches the story. Number 6, if you can start your story with no exposition at all, that is ideal. If some exposition is unavoidable, you should keep it as short as possible. Alright, for this one, as promised, I'm going to show you a comic book story that I've never shown before in any of these videos, or even referred to, really. It's from this collection called Bohemians, in which they invited lots of different illustrators and writers to create comic books about, for the most part, real people. And I was sort of assigned or invited to write about Harvey Pekar and R. Crumb, the great underground cartoonists. And I invented this brief scene between the two of them, kind of imagining something that might have taken place, although I put a disclaimer here saying that this is really a work of fiction. It's I don't know that they ever had conversations like this, but it throws you into the scene without any exposition. Now, those of you who don't know the word exposition, I should briefly explain what it is. That's when you basically start telling things to the reader or to the viewer rather than showing them these things by way of a scene. I always give as an example in Ratatouille at the beginning. They do this freeze frame when Remy is crashing through the window and he says, "This is me." And he starts talking and telling you things instead of showing them to you. Or showing and telling simultaneously. Anyway, that stuff is referred to as exposition. that's when you kind of just have to feed information to the viewer. And as I said here, it may be unavoidable. Some exposition may be unavoidable. You just got to get this information to the reader so that you can begin your story. And I think that was the case with Ratatouille. We had to tell you a few things about this rat before we could really get into the scenes that are showing you the story instead of just feeding you information. But in this case, with Picard and Crumb, I just throw you into this scene, and you see this guy over here saying, "It never fails, I swear to God." And they're looking at this big billboard about taking Cleveland into a brighter tomorrow. And we move on to the next panel, and Harvey says, it's like they look for the best parts of the city and tear them down for no good reason. So we're basically just forcing you to interpret, what am I looking at? Who are these guys? And gain all of your information by way of the dialogue and the visuals. These days especially, I think that is considered the ideal way. Limit the amount of exposition, if at all possible. And if you can eliminate it completely, that might be the ideal. And in many stories you will see that there is no exposition, no narration even at all. But let me go on and take you into number 7, the last of my pieces of advice for this video. The first page of your rough draft won't necessarily make it into the final story. You may get a better idea later on and decide to start the story an entirely different way. That is certainly the case with a lot of my stories. You get into it, you start writing, and only then do you figure out what is the best way to start the story. I think with like the drawing lesson, I knew that I wanted him to begin by meeting this woman in the park and sort of forcing her to be his art teacher. But I somehow understood that we couldn't just start with a random boy in a park and have any idea of who he was. We needed a sort of preliminary scene to set it up, and I didn't come up with that until after I'd kind of mapped out the whole story. So a lot of times these things come to you later on. Your first draft, you may have a scene that you thought was going to be awesome, and then as you get halfway through the story, as writing it, for the first time, it suddenly dawns on you, no, that's not the way. I should start it some other way. So leave yourself free to get these fresh ideas. The first, getting your pencil down on the paper or whatever, or tapping away at the keyboard, you're just getting started, and you're not necessarily going to have your best idea for the true beginning of the story right at the start. Well, that is going to bring us to the end of this video, but I do want to just say a special word to those of you who ordered the Mastering Manga books, those of you who are interested in my advice on storytelling. All 3 of these books contain lots of advice about comic book creation, page layouts, and indeed the type of storytelling concerns that we've been getting into today. But I think it's time to wind down this video. I want to thank you all for watching it. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.